up and running. My name is Cocilova. I'm an attorney at the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, and I'm part of the DC Grassroots Planning and working together for the past 3 years now, coalescing around the DC Comprehensive Plan, which is DC's 20-year plan for development. Many of us in this group have been part of the community for a very long time. It's made up of ANCs, experts, people with lived experience, work experience, people who come from a variety of places throughout the city. We want to make sure that DC is growing and developing in a way that is truly inclusive and not excluding folks who have been here for a long time. Many of you have probably participated in the Grassroots Planning Coalition before. You may have even been on our webinar a few weeks ago, so welcome back. And this is sort of a continuation of the conversation that we had then, which we today are going to be focusing on how the impact of COVID-19 on housing in the city and homelessness, and do kind of a discussion around what it looked like before COVID hit and how COVID has had a greater impact on that. We are very fortunate today to have several experts on our panel and to be joined by Councilwoman Brianne Nadeau, who will be able to ask her some questions as well. Before I turn it over to the speakers, I just want to give a little overview of the comprehensive plan for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So as I said, DC's comprehensive plan is a 20-year plan for development. It is a really, really big document. It's made up of 13 citywide elements, which means these are things that cover anybody who's in the city, including things like land use, transportation, housing, economic development, etc. And then there are 10 area elements that divide up the city into 10 groupings. So it's not super intuitive because it's not done by ward, but it's done by various parts of the city. Right now we are in an amendment cycle, meaning that the comprehensive plan is going through a series of edits. It's been happening for the past few years, and it's gotten a lot of attention in the media, on council, in communities, etc. And so that's why we've been kind of focusing on that. Before I jump into Ms. High, who will kind of lead us off, I actually want to start us out with a quote that kind of sets the stage for what we're about to hear, because we're about to hear from people who have actual solutions to the problems that we've been seeing. And I think this is said very poignantly by Naomi Klein, who's a journalist who wrote the Shock Doctrine. So many of you have probably heard of her before. Ms. Klein said, "In times of crisis, seemingly impossible ideas suddenly become possible. But whose ideas? Sensible, fair ones designed to keep as many people as possible safe, secure, and healthy, or predatory ideas designed to further enrich the already unimaginable wealthy while leaving the most vulnerable further exposed?" So I'd just like us to think about that as we hear from experts with, like I said, who has been thinking about these things for years before COVID even happened. And with that, I will turn it over to Ms. High. Ms. High is a 20-year DC resident, having resided 19 years at Park Morton. She can explain more about Park Morton and where that is. She's a mother of two that currently serves as president of the council at Park Morton, chair of the Park Morton NCI Steering Committee, developer of the Park Morton Equity Plan, and she's the owner of High Alert Emergency Preparedness, or HAER Prep, or Higher Prep, a local small business specializing in disaster preparedness. So I will turn it over to Ms. High.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me today. I wanted to just speak briefly about the Park Morton Equity Plan. It is centering around this COVID-19 pandemic because DC Housing Authority is still currently moving residents off of our property very rapidly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Part of the Park Morton Equity Plan was keeping our residents in Ward 1 by having the Bruce Monroe site. However, that's still tied up in litigation. So the alternative was to use the REN. By utilizing the REN, we can not only keep our residents in Ward 1, we could also partner with the grocery store that is being built at the bottom to use the human capital piece to allow for residents to attain jobs. moving them towards self-sufficiency. And in situations like my own, we can create jobs, you know, by becoming entrepreneurs. Um, NCI right now is currently, this year makes 13 years behind schedule. We started this project in 2007. Uh, like I said before, DCHA has been currently still moving residents, even without a bill for site, even during the COVID pandemic. And they keep saying that residents want to move. I don't know how true that is, because with many residents being moved to Ward 7 and 8, where there is a high death rate of African Americans in that ward, I don't think they would choose to move during a pandemic that would, number one, endanger their life and endanger it moving into an area where there is a higher mortality rate. Um, Also, the Park Morton Equity Plan is something that stems off from my own future and futures of residents like me that want to have something better, that want to build a future for our children. You know, we all wanted to move towards equity, owning, home ownership. You know, some of us want to continue to rent, and that's fine. But some of us want to remain in our neighborhood, and to guarantee that, we need equity. And we have yet to receive any documentation from DC Housing Authority, DMPED, or anybody else guaranteeing that our residents can, number one, return to Park Morton when the redevelopment is completed. Number two, that we would have home ownership. And these are things that are being said, but have not been put in writing and presented to me so that we can sign them and guarantee that residents have these um, guarantees that we will have home ownership, that we will have a right to return to the multifamily building if we want to rent, to return to a townhome if they have a voucher and they want to rent a townhome for their family size. So, you know, there are many things that are happening. And one thing that I also want to point out is that this pandemic has put a dent in the financials for the economics, you know. And I'm wondering right now, because DC Housing Authority and DMPED already had a $30 million plus funding gap to finish this development. And I'm wondering where they're going to get that from now, you know. So I really want our residents to have an opportunity to be able to purchase a home and remain in their neighborhood. And for those that have already been shunned from their community, how can we get them back? How can we guarantee that they'll be able to return?
Thank you for that, Ms. High. I just want to have a few clarifying questions for you. And we will be doing more questions at the end of the panelists, just for everybody who's watching.
Okay.
But we have a few more minutes left, so I want to just pull out a couple things that you mentioned. And then also, just as a housekeeping thing that I forgot to mention at the beginning, because we're still getting used to doing these Zoom meetings, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to put them in the chat. Or if you have comments, but if you have questions, please use the Q&A at the bottom. We're going to do our best to take as many questions as we can. And like I said, those will be held until the end of the panelists. So we will hopefully get to all of your questions. Ms. High, you mentioned a few things. And like I said, thanks again for being here. We had a good conversation the other day. I'm very familiar with what's been going on at Park Morton. I think a lot of us are. And if you're not, you should be, first of all. But second, this is something that's happening across the city in public housing units. We've seen a complete divestment in public housing and over the course of many years, which has allowed units to go into ruin. And then there's kind of this impetus to shut them down and get people out, because people shouldn't have to stay in horrible conditions like that. And it's not just happening in public housing, it's also happening in also, you know, slumlords across the city are doing this in private units as well. And because of that disinvestment and because of those poor units, like I said, people want to leave, but also there's this idea that public housing should be privatized. We've seen the pattern of privatization of public housing across the city and across the country. And so, Ms. High, if you wouldn't mind just clarifying a couple things. So, one, what is NCI, or the New Communities Initiative? So, just explain a little bit about that. And then, two, just go a little deeper into the plan to potentially use that new building that you mentioned that's down the street for people who are currently at Park Morton.
Okay, the New Communities Initiative came about right after Hope 6. Hope 6 didn't work out too well, so I guess they kind of respun it. New Communities Initiative is supposed to, and I use this very loosely, is supposed to come in and rebuild the community and bring the community members back. However, NCI has failed to complete a project and return residents to their home. Going deeper into, you said, what was the second question you said?
Yeah, just explaining a little bit more about what the equity plan looks like. How would you move people into the
Oh,
unit?
into the REN?
Yeah.
So the REN, we could use vouchers to move in the same way that DC Housing Authority is using the vouchers, the federal vouchers to move families out currently. They could use vouchers to move people into the REN. The REN also has IZ units, inclusionary zoning units, that a lot of our working families will qualify for. Some of the units are income based, you know, so some of the families who would not qualify for an IZ unit would qualify for an income based unit. So there are many different ways to get, you know, families implemented into the REN. It's just all about NCI, DEMPED, DCHA, and our councilwoman all working together to implement the Park Morton Equity Plan to utilize the REN while we wait for a decision on the Bruce Monroe parcel of land.
Great. So just to wrap it up and make sure that we're all understanding, so Park Morton is a public housing complex that's up on Georgia Avenue, and there was supposed to be a new development happening down the street at the Bruce Monroe Park, like you mentioned, but that hasn't happened yet. And so the plan is to move people that are in Park Morton down the street a little bit further into a new luxury building that went up that's going to have a Whole Foods at the bottom, if I'm correct on
Right,
that, called the Wren.
right.
And you're saying that the equity plan specifically outlines how that could happen. And it's just a matter of making sure that people, all of these different government agencies that you mentioned, DC Housing Authority, council, just as a whole, the New Communities Initiative, et cetera, working together to use that plan and actually make it happen.
Yes, correct.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. We'll come back to you again, like I said, at the end, but
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you being on. And let's jump over now to Roger Williams. So, excuse me, Roger Williams has been active with the DC Tenants Union for a while, and I'll let him give a little introduction to himself and then explain some of the work that they've been doing.
I want to bring up this. Hello. I have been actively involved with the issue of truly affordable rental housing since 2017. And I'm currently a member of the citywide DC Tenant Union. The Tenant Union was launched in August of last year. I also participated in the Tivoli Gardens Tenant Association. The Tenant Association is a byproduct of a state of emergency invoked by the mayor. I would like to talk to you today about the importance of rent strikes. The 226 unit Tivoli Gardens complexes In Columbia Heights, that is, the residents who are members of the Tenants Association began a rent strike as of May the 1st. People are withholding their rent because they are out of work. Some have had their hours reduced to the point that they cannot cover their living expenses. Then there are those whom are still getting their normal income. Those in the latter category have decided to stop paying. They've decided to stop paying rent to be in solidarity with those who cannot pay. We want management and the owners to agree to suspension of rents, starting with the month of April and continuing until 30 days after the state of emergency is lifted. Management has already refused our demands. So where does that leave us? It leaves the Tenant Association with leverage because of emergency legislation enacted by the City Council and the Mayor. No evictions proceedings can begin until 30 days after the lifting of the shutdown. No late fees, no legal fees can be charged. Now, the crucial issue is, what do the renters do with this unprecedented advantage? Unfortunately, most will probably squander the opportunity given to them, meaning they will never utilize the ability to mount a rent strike. Already, the national organization representing landlords is lobbying the Congress to bail out apartment owners. Excuse me. More tenants organize rent strikes, the more pressure the apartment owners lobbyist group will exert on the House and the Senate for relief. This is where the leverage is, but only if renters quickly seize the moment. There's literally not a moment to lose. The window of opportunity will slam shut hard and fast, exactly 30 days after Muriel Bowser lifts her shutdown. Renters can waste this opportunity at their peril. Ultimately, the various rent strikes happening in the city should be dealt with by the elected officials, the city council, and the mayor. They could invoke the need to maintain public health, safety, and order as a compelling reason for the government to intervene. We were talking about what happens when the floodgate is open and tens of thousands of residents are evicted. The council this past Wednesday pondered enacting legislation that would give renters perhaps a year to catch up on their back rent. Even for those still fully employed, signing on to a payment plan to catch up on back rents owed will be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. For those who lost livelihoods, a repayment agreement is not the answer. How many managements will enter into repayment agreements once they determine that lessees are unemployed or working reduced hours that do not even allow the resident to stay current with future monthly rent? What is the answer? The elected officials must have unrelenting pressure exerted against those of them who have a deficient interest in our situation. The other key pressure point is at the polls. The Democratic primary occurs in early June. There are 4 council seats that will be voted on. There is a really good crop of challengers whom, if elected, could make a world of difference. At the same time, there are a number of bad actors who are challenging for those 4 council seats. Learn who the good candidates are and vote for them. If you are not registered, get registered to vote. On election day, exercise your franchise. If enough of our crowd turns out and votes, we can change our circumstances, but only if we vote. We rent, we vote, we can force a paradigm shift. I guess that's about all. I hope that will help those who are listening and watching. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roger. And I know, like you mentioned, you've been involved in the rent control struggle for a really long time as someone who has used rent control. Can you just speak a little bit to the changes that COVID has brought to the Reclaim Rent Control platform that was proposed prior to the crisis, if there have been any changes?
You know, I think one thing that it's done is it's drained the city of funds, and it's pushed our rent control platform demands to the back burner temporarily.
And
you're welcome.
Go ahead, you can finish it.
Not to mention that it's put people, folks that are working and are now either working less hours or not employed at all, in a bind. And there's a day of reckoning that's going to occur, and the day of reckoning comes 30 days after that moratorium or lifting of the state of emergency happens.
Yeah, that's very real. And I mean, as Reggie will discuss in a minute, I think a lot of us have been kind of trapped in what do we do right now, because the needs of people are so urgent, but that kind of blinds us or makes us not look so much at the future, and it kind of, you know, obfuscates our ability to look at even a month out after this dissipates, or, you know, however this ends up concluding or slowing down a little bit. What are we going to do after that? Because the immediate steps will have an impact on what comes later. So we have to make sure that we're thinking through the long-term strategies right now at the same time, or else we will, like you said, a lot of people will be pushed out. A lot more people will become homeless. A lot of people will end up out of DC, quite frankly, because we've already seen that happening with gentrification too.
You know, one of the things that our Reclaim Rent Control platform, which we need the city council and the mayor to sign on to, would close loopholes and expand rent control. That doesn't cost the city a dime, but the pressure against that is from the landlords and the developers and the real estate industry that have other designs. So there we are.
Right. So it sounds like from what you said at the end of your presentation too, that a lot of it is in the hands, it's a political movement. It has to be political, and it has to come from the decision makers to make that choice and to figure out ways to truly serve people versus just kind of letting it run its course, because if it runs its course, people won't be protected.
You know, and unfortunately, keeping in mind that there are a number of elected officials, my sense is, that are following a different message, you know, one that may have begun when Alice Rivlin, the economist, wrote her report at the behest of former Mayor Anthony Williams, which was to bring new people in, and I guess they might call it benign, I would call it malignant neglect for the other folks. So there's a sense that I have that there are those who think if you own property and you pay property tax, you can have a seat at the table. And if you don't, then you'll just have to deal with the results.
Excuse me just 1 minute. I have a delivery of food coming, so please excuse me. I'm gonna be right back. Just excuse me.
Okay, thank you, Ms. High. And yeah, Roger, thank you for raising that too with Anthony Williams' plan to bring more folks to the city. I think he was trying to incentivize 100,000 new residents to DC. And it's very interesting because when Mayor Bowser proposed her housing proposal last May, she similarly said she wanted to create 36,000 units of housing, 24,000 of which would be market rate, 12,000 of which would be affordable, but affordability was not defined. And it's interesting because those numbers sort of parallel each other, because 36,000 units, you could say, are about 100,000 residents if you have 2.5 members of a household for that specific unit. So you're right, we are part of why a lot of us have been doing this work is because we're recognizing the type of city that we're planning for and who we're planning for, and how these various decisions impact kind of all of us collectively. So thank you for that. I'm going to jump over to Reggie now and give a brief intro into who he is, and then we'll circle back around, like I said, for more questions. So Reggie Black is a native Washingtonian who experienced homelessness for 8 years. He's currently advocacy director for the People for Fairness Coalition and was appointed as a consumer representative to the ICH, which is the Interagency Council on Homelessness. You've probably all seen Reggie before. He's been around for a while doing this work, and he's going to talk a bit about how COVID has impacted the homeless community and what is a step that we can use on the housing front to alleviate that pressure.
Good afternoon, everybody. Of course, as Caitlin said, my name is Reginald Black, and all of those things. My chief concern is about our homeless or unhoused population. They are particularly vulnerable population due to not having a stable setting or home. During the COVID-19 health crisis, the mayor's stay-home order further exposed them to the elements. Our current shelter makeup does not and will not allow for proper social distancing. I'm not advocating against shelter. We will always have a need for it, but I am advocating for housing opportunities in the midst of the emergency. This is why we propose the vacant to virus reduction plan. So some basis for this is that we have found some research that has come from the chief financial officer's office, and in 2019 has documented about 10,000 vacant apartment units in about 3,000 buildings in DC. Our plan is to use these identified vacant properties to house the unhoused. Our process calls for a housing first approach that does not include significant barriers that already exist. If giving public dollars to corporations has not helped solve the housing crisis, then maybe we should do something different. An example of a property we could use is at Hill East. The Hill East project, we are targeting 47. It's a great opportunity to implement this plan. And as we get a second wave of the virus, and as I was getting ready to say, we are targeting 47 units, which were in the disposition agreement with Donatelli as a community benefit. We can use the vacant to virus reduction pilot program to address that community benefit issue and to make sure that people who are homeless now have the opportunity to better social distance and self-isolate. We can use these 47 units should be available until more units at this site become available. It is important to note that almost all of the 31 to 60 AMI units from the Hill East project were eliminated. These units in particular are key to long-term housing stability, which is what the vacant to virus reduction program will address. And these things are some things we want you to try to contact these individuals here to, say that you want this reduction plan implemented And if you out there are a part of a community and feel or know that there may be vacancies within your unit, we also want to emphasize that you should contact your landlord and encourage them to help us implement this plan. Like I said, it will help people further social distance. It will help us mitigate the spread of the virus within the homeless community. It will give them a better opportunity to self-isolate and to social distance. And we can then look at recovery supports, and then we can also use those units to look at long-term and permanent housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. And that is what has compounded the COVID-19 emergency, is that people who are experiencing homelessness, they are further exposed and further vulnerable to not only just the weather, but also exposure to the virus. We have sort of regulated them to large congregate settings, and we have not provided things such as laundry, such as an effective way to shower and to promote hygiene. There are porta potties and hand washing stations all over the city, but really what is needed is a safe place for people to be so that they can adhere to the stay home order and be able to better take care of themselves. And I think that it would be incumbent upon us to try to secure any vacant units that are existing in the city, and especially if there are parties that want to get some sort of property tax or whatever cancellations to support their business in place. Two of those players, and actually was I believe the developer of the wharf, and of course another one in that whole group was Donatelli. These people are asking for public money, but they have yet to serve the public. And I think that those units should be required to help us with this pilot. We can start with the Heal East project, and it will help us stabilize people better than what we're doing right now. And I think that us leaving people who may not fit some of the emergency criteria for quarantine and isolation, or as they call it, PEPV, which basically is a facility for medically vulnerable people, you leave all of these other people vulnerable. And I think our vacancy pilot program is the perfect way to be able to help all of those who won't fit into those settings. And we can start with these 47 units and expand it out into other buildings that are online that have vacancies. And I just want to emphasize that, tell people you want the vacant to virus plan implemented.
Great, thank you for that, Reggie. Just as a reminder to folks who are participating, we see some questions coming in. We will be asking them in just a moment, so thank you for sending those in. And another reminder that the council member put in there is that she's participating in her official capacity and can't be involved in conversations about candidates or campaigns. That's definitely not the intent. We are all most of us are working at nonprofits too, but I think, we will be having a discussion around like law and how politics, in terms of having people who are decision makers making these decisions, impacts the future of our city. So I think that's been the intent. But just as a quick reminder there, this is nonpartisan. Reggie, going back, it sounds like the vacant to virus reduction proposal, I know we've talked a lot about this for a while, and a lot of people in the community have been working on this. And just so folks, the title may sound a little bit familiar because it sounds like the mayor's vacant to vibrant plan that was proposed a few years ago, which was using land that was vacant and putting it up for bid to the highest bidder in order to then like revitalize that space. And so, Reggie, it sounds like this plan, as we've discussed, is a way to kind of do the same thing, but use vacant housing units in order to decongregate the shelters, like you said. And instead of having folks who kind of maintain those vacant units just be able to profit off of their vacancy, have them be used to assist people. And it's interesting too, it sounds very similar to what Ms. High was proposing in her equity plan with the Wren, because the Wren is a building that's sitting empty right now. It may have had more people come into it, were we not in these times, but right now it's just sitting empty. And so the proposal is, well, we have people who need housing, we have housing that's available. Let's put those two things together and just make it work. So I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add before we jump into questions, Reggie.
Yeah, one of the things that I think people kind of don't understand is what is sort of like the normal process for housing, because there are things that have to happen before you get into a unit, and because we're in an emergency, that allows us to kind of like bypass some of those things. So like there's credit checks involved. We can bypass that because we're just using that unit for now, during the emergency. Later on, we will try to figure out how we can get those people in the units into a more permanent setting, whether they may transfer to another available unit or they may stay in that unit. But normally, you have to go through an entire triage. You have to go through a case review or case conference. And when we initially proposed these different action steps to house homeless people, two things just did not materialize themselves, but have appeared in the data we were able to pull to come up with this pilot program. One was a repository of available units. We had always talked about a housing gateway where vacant units would appear to the case managers and to those actually doing the housing matches. We have somehow deferred to the housingsearch.org website as that gateway and have gotten away from what we originally intended, what we call coordinated entry, or CAP, which is coordinated access and housing placement system, to be. We're supposed to have a running repository of vacancies, and we're supposed to have it in a database that we can access to get those people into housing. So without those things, the normal housing process is extremely slow, because you have to search that entire site looking for an available unit. And the DC Housing Search.org site, while it's great in theory, in practice is not as helpful as it could be, because the information is really incumbent upon the landlords updating that information accurately. And I don't think there's a system in place that allows them to do that. Our database would have allowed them to be able to work with case managers to update the information. So that piece of the infrastructure, just, I don't know, we fell away from that. And that has slowed down the housing process for too many people. And I think our process is a way to actually replace what we had already planned to do and just haven't done.
Thank you for that additional information. So let's turn over to some of the questions that have been coming in the chat so far. And I'm going to let Renee. So Renee is also on here. She's part of the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition, and she's helping coordinate some of the questions. And Renee, if you could just unmute yourself. Thanks.
Thank you. I am going to start at the top because the questions, most of them, I can't put them together and just ask fewer, but we only have about 4 or 5. Let me actually go with a question that is related to Reggie's presentation. One participant is asking whether Councilmember Nadeau will she be supporting the Hill East plan proposed by Mr. Black?
Are we going for me now? I thought we were doing the panel's Q&A first.
Should I hold that question?
Yeah, we can do that. Go ahead, Renee. Why don't you hold that and we'll just do some of the questions for the panelists for now.
Oh, okay. The first question was, what funding tools is DC, the federal government, putting in place to allow existing residents toward or to maintain home ownership? And that may be directed to Shonta High or anyone on the panel.
Yeah, so Ms. High is still, Ms. High is really directly involved in the community. And as we said, because this is an emergency, people are having their needs met at various times. And she's currently doing food delivery, I think, within Park Morton. So she had to step away. But
Okay.
if Roger or Reggie, if you want to try to answer that, you can. We can also hold on to that until a little bit later once the council member is part of the discussion too.
So I know that there have been federal CARES package releases. I believe the DC Council has had maybe 1 or 2 bills released, which include, I believe, a sort of like rental freeze or more deferment. I don't know if those provisions really go as far as they need to help people maintain that housing. And in spots, they're anecdotal, but I've heard of people being moved out of places and evicted contrary to the national order, contrary to our district order. So, even though you may have a mortgage deferment in a property, we still haven't explained how do residents access that information and find out if they are entitled to that rent freeze. And then, on the back end, is that rent freeze canceled, or do people have to, pay that back rent? So I think there are things in place, and I think that there are proposals that need to be stood up somewhere. But right now, all I know is the mortgage deferment, which allows a rent freeze on some properties.
Okay. These next 2 questions would probably be for Roger Williams of the DC Tenants Union. When people are using vouchers, they don't have an option to participate in rent strikes if their contribution is 0. However, those who are paying 30% of their income for their voucher program are often worried they will lose their voucher if they withhold rent in a rent strike. How do you suppose they support both groups of voucher holders who wish to participate in a rent strike?
Roger, if you could just unmute yourself.
Unmute, buddy.
Am I unmuted now?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. My area of expertise doesn't lend itself to answering that question. I'm not sure how they would use the vouchers that they have under the present circumstances. Maybe someone else might have an answer for that. Maybe Reggie.
So those things aren't too clear if they participate in a rent strike. So I know DCHA, who administers the voucher programs, they have a set of qualifications that go into how the actual unit is supposed to look and operate. If there is a violation order put out by that agency's inspectors, then there is some action to correct that. If the correction doesn't happen, then they don't terminate the voucher from the tenant. They terminate the voucher from the landlord, and there's supposed to be emergency provisions and stuff to move that tenant out of a unit that has failed those qualifications. In terms of rent strike, I'm not sure how that would play out, because a lot of people like myself, we pay 30% of our income in rent. And if we have a valid reason to conduct a rent strike, then also we would kind of have the backing of the housing authority already, because the violation is already there and already documented by an inspector. So, you know, I think that if you do have certain violations in a housing project, that you should have them documented. And if you are conducting a rent strike on those types of issues, you just need to have your paperwork so that the voucher isn't terminated from the person for non-payment of rent. I think there are ways to challenge that, but nobody is really clear about how to go about that, because a lot of people in the city have subsidized rents, and they need to have, they need to have a way to address issues, and a lot of those issues are valid. But at this point, as far as the emergency and the rent cancellation thing, I don't know how that's going to affect voucher holders. I wish Director Garrett was around somewhere to directly answer that question. How would they try to, communicate with people that have certain issues about rent? But he's not here to answer that.
Okay, this is the next question is with regard to people in private housing who have successfully challenged in DC Superior Court the poor housing conditions, and they've won. And what this questioner says, that what is being done to have any of these, what she says, it stays on the docket of DC Superior Court, and that she's experienced retaliation because of that. So what is being done to have these negatives removed from people's rental history? Someone that has successfully challenged because of poor conditions and going to other housing, she's been denied housing because the landlords have seen her history that she's challenged poor housing conditions and been successful.
I know Caitlin is our moderator, but I have worked closely with her office on certain bills that basically scrub the eviction record if there was a judgment for the tenant. And I know that law is in play, so I don't see how there is even a record of that. If the tenant goes into landlord tenant court on a specific issue, whether that's a voucher or whether you're just paying outright, and you actually get a judgment in your favor, then if the landlord tried to evict you, that eviction record is supposed to be expunged. And I've worked with several lawyers, including Legal Aid Society, I believe the Washington Lawyers Committee, and the Legal Clinic as well, on making sure that that was in the recent eviction law that we passed, the Eviction with Dignity Act. Yeah. So those things are supposed to be expunged in the District of Columbia, as far as I know.
Why don't we take, Renee, let's take one more question.
And I'll save the question about the Parkmore Equity Plan because Ms. High is not here.
So if Renee, is it okay if we just jump down just for the last question so we can have it be a little shorter for Ms. High? I was gonna see if Ms. High, would you be able to, I know you're in and out, so hopefully you can hear me.
Is she here?
Yeah, she's right there.
Okay. Let me ask her then, because there was a question about how can residents support the Park Morton Equity Plan, the rent class, well, they're asking about the rent cancellation campaign and the vacant to virus.
Yeah, so let me jump in, Renee, for 1 second. Sorry, we will get to that at the end, but I wanted to actually go down to the last question on here, which is how can public housing residents secure home ownership? And I know, Ms. Hyatt, that is a big concern about your equity plan. The whole purpose is to make sure that people can have money in their pockets and accrue equity and, provide for themselves in that fashion. So I would love for you to just talk a little bit about that. How can public housing residents secure home ownership? And if you could just unmute yourself first, because, yeah, thank you.
Sorry about that. DC Housing Authority has a family self-sufficiency program that they implemented for voucher holders, but did not implement for public housing residents. They are currently supposed to be implementing that. This will supposedly allow us to save money without being penalized. However, I feel like with the way that things are going right now, we need to save money now, to be able to start building, building credit to pay off whatever debt needs to be paid. In order to do that, we need to be able to save some money in different areas, because you need a down payment for a home. You need some money in the bank for closing costs, especially if you're going to be paying out of pocket. And I was offering different ways for people to be able to purchase, even if they couldn't purchase directly out of pocket. I was offering LECs. LECs are limited equity co-ops. This would allow, multiple families to pit their monies together and purchase a building and own it together, and pass it down from generation to generation to generation and allow their families to remain in their community. I was offering, programs like Habitat for Humanity, MICASA, and Mana Inc. that will allow you to spend anywhere from 30% to 60% of your AMI, which is area median income, to be able to purchase a home. So there are many different ways that you can enter into programs to purchase a home. However, the rules and regulations that we live under with DC Housing Authority does not allow us to save but a certain amount of money before we're penalized and our rent goes up, and they take all of the money away from us before we're squashed right back down into the place that we're at. And this is why we have been generational in the projects. People want to know why, families, why are so many generations growing up in the project? It's the rules the guidelines that we have to live under.
Right, so people are being systemically kept in poverty based on the rules and the guidelines, like you just mentioned, and not being able to kind of accrue wealth without losing access to other benefits that they need at the time. So that there's never really a full going up. It's kind of a going up. You make it to a certain level, and then you get dropped all the way back down, and you have to build yourself all the way back up. And that's a policy choice. That's not based on something that individual did.
Right.
Okay, so why don't we'll switch over for right now. Thank you to our panelists. We're going to switch over to Councilwoman Nadeau or Councilmember Nadeau, and we'll, let her introduce herself and then ask a few questions that the steering committee has submitted already, and then we'll go into some questions from both the audience. I see some more coming up in the chat and the questions, so thank you, and also from our panelists. So Brianne and Nadeau, if you want to go ahead and.
Thank you so much. And I have a link to the bill that we introduced for record sealing for evictions that I was trying to figure out where that question was so I could just paste the link into it, but we can do it later. I'm going to see if I can roll in some responses while I'm talking too, because I've seen the questions that the people have posed. So I'm Brianne Nadeau, I'm the Ward 1 council member. On the Housing Committee, I'm also chair of the Committee on Human Services. So, all these panelists really are coming together in my world. As the Ward 1 representative, Park Morton is just up the street from my house. And it's a project that I've been working on since before I was council member. So let me just start by saying thank you to the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition and to the Reclaim Rent Control Coalition, and to Ms. High. It's really good to be together, and some really great ideas. So quick updates. Well, let me start by saying this. So affordable housing has been a huge priority for me since I've been council member. We've gotten more than 1,000 units of affordable housing in the pipeline. My focus has really been below 50% of area median income, so families making less than $50,000 a year. But oftentimes it's been way less. Park Morton is a mixed income project, but the top priority is replacement housing for the people who live there now. And those are for people making less than $30,000 a year. That project has been stalled because of a lawsuit on the Build First site. So as Ms. High very clearly articulated, the plan was always to build first down at Bruce Monroe's site on Georgia between Columbia and Irving, and have that beautiful housing ready so Park Morton residents could move in. And once we got sued by a handful of neighbors on that block, we've been waiting for the courts to make a decision about allowing us to move forward on that. So in lieu of that, the Housing Authority has been preparing the Park Morton site now for phase one. So they'll be doing some building on the Park Road site so that they can deliver that housing while we wait for the court verdict. But it's really frustrating because it shows you how three people can hold up housing for 500 or more in this instance. Because once we finish the project, it'll not just be for the Park Morton residents, but 3 times the number of people that we've been serving on the existing. Did the ANC support the lawsuit or the neighbors? The ANC supports the project. I'm sorry, I'm seeing comments coming.
So if you don't mind, we'll do a few minutes of just intro, Brianne, or Councilmember Nadeau, and then I'm going to ask you the questions that I have. So don't worry about the questions in the chat right now.
All right, let me get back on topic. So when it comes to the Housing Authority, there's a number of measures that the council is considering. I've introduced a couple bills, and the one that I think is most relevant to our discussion today is really the Public Housing Preservation and Tenant Protection Amendment Act, which would require the Housing Authority to prioritize their existing tenants when they're redeveloping sites. Similar to what we proposed at Park Morton, which is supposed to be happening at Park Morton, is people should have the right to return. Build first should be a priority so people aren't displaced while the building is going on. And it really codifies a number of rights for public housing residents that haven't existed formally in DC law, even though they've been considered by HUD as best practices. Of course, everyone knows that rent control is being reauthorized right now. And I was really proud to sign on to the Reclaim Rent Control platform. My big concern right now is that the rent control reauthorization is looking like it will move through the Housing Committee without any changes to the current law. And so I'm working with the coalition. I expect I'll probably have some amendments to the bill that's moving. There's also an interest in introducing the Reclaim Rent Control platform as its own legislation, which I support. And what we want to do is expand rent control, close the loopholes, just like Roger was talking about. And Reginald brought up some really important points as well. As chair of the Committee on Human Services, I've been prioritizing ending chronic homelessness for individuals living on the streets. We've been doing some great work with families. We've made a lot of progress there. We've opened 6 or 7 now short-term family housing sites. But the singles system is really, really broken, and Reginald knows that from his experience. So what I did in this year's budget was fund 585 new units of permanent supportive housing. So when we talk about things like the Hill East plan, I'll say the Interagency Council on Homelessness has done tremendous work, and Reginald, thank you for your service there on working with landlords to get them to accept the housing subsidies that we're funding. So, we have the ability to house 585 people who need not only housing, but wraparound supports. But we can only do that if we have landlords who are working with us. Because otherwise it takes it's really hard to just take a voucher and try to find housing. You really do need support. And so those vacant units are part of it, but of course funding subsidies for folks who need them is the other piece. And that's been a huge focus of mine. And right now during COVID-19, I've been advocating for putting people in hotels as an interim measure, and then moving them to permanent housing, because we're really putting people at risk in many of the congregate sites that we have. New York Avenue has had, I believe, more than 100 cases now, and I'm very concerned about sites like that in CCNV, where we just heard DHS is going to be putting more people. So please join me in my effort to get people out of congregate sites, both as a preventative measure, and of course we already do that when they're sick. But we now are doing more testing in shelters of anyone who's got symptoms and anyone who's been exposed. So we're definitely pushing and making progress on that. I think I can leave it there because I suspect we can get to most of what else I wanted to say through questions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm going to circle back to some of the points that you just made, but I do want to just to make some clarifying points and follow-up questions. But I do want to jump into the questions that came through from steering committee members and community members who knew you'd be on with us today. One is, given the impact of COVID generally on the budget, we've been hearing, we know the mayor's about to drop her budget on May 12th, and we have already heard that there will be at least $600 million cut from the budget based on the projections by the CFO. So as you go into budget season, and knowing that you're chairing the Human Services Committee too, what are your top budget priorities, and how will you make sure that there won't be budget cuts and perhaps be budget increases to programs that are needed for communities that have been disinvested in for a long time?
So the big priority for me in this scenario is going to be preservation of the programs that we fought for. We were so aggressive last year in the funding that we got for housing for homeless families and individuals. And I think we'll be able to defend that. I think the piece that comes up again and again and was raised by a couple of the panelists is, what are we going to do for folks who need rental assistance? We know the emergency rental assistance program runs out of money every year. Now there are more people than ever who are going to be depending on it. The mayor has identified $1.5 million worth of federal funding to add to that, but it's not going to be enough. And so I was invited to make a presentation to the Reopen DC committee that oversees human services. And one of the points that I really tried to drive home was, we're going to have to find more funding for rental assistance. We need to be able to keep people in their homes, and rental is the best way to prevent eviction and to prevent homelessness. So that's a key priority for me. I know that there's a number of folks already organizing around this. I'm not sure we know how much we need yet. I've asked for at least 10 million every year, and we haven't been able to get that together. So we know we need at least that much in normal circumstances. And then the thing to keep in mind is, our local funding, we probably can find more federal dollars for rental assistance, I believe, based on what I'm reading in the auditor's report that just came to the council. But we have to be careful with federal funding because that doesn't help everybody. So, the number of undocumented residents we have in the city, we certainly need to be using local funds for them and prioritizing that, and moving federal funds in for people who are eligible for any type of program.
And on the funding piece too, I know, you mentioned preserving programs that have been fought for and had increased amounts for a long time, but we do know that even pre-COVID, we had one of the highest rates of homelessness per capita in the country too. And I think, we all have been talking about how we really need to have transformative changes occur. We can't just keep fighting for the status quo, because the status quo wasn't working for everyone. Even if right before COVID started, we came out and said that DC had a pretty healthy economy. But how do we have a healthy economy when we have tens of thousands of people living on the streets and hundreds of thousands of people who are rented here? So hopefully we can continue to work on that too at the council perspective. You mentioned the Reopen DC, that you had a chance to do a presentation for them. And we have a lot of people have been concerned about who is on that committee and who is on the board and who's kind of chairing each of those sectors, because when it initially dropped, there was a big gap in terms of people who, even folks who are on this call right now, who are experts, but who weren't even considered to express the concerns of people who are on the ground with lived experience, renters, teachers, etc. Do you share some of these concerns, and what influence do you anticipate the group ultimately having on how DC reopens?
Yeah, so council wasn't consulted on the composition either. And certainly I gave feedback in places where I felt like they could use some additional perspectives. And in the meantime, what I tried to do in my role is represent those perspectives in the 5 minutes that I was given to present to the Reopen Committee, and am directing constituents to the place where they can contribute their feedback to. So we continue to get feedback. I'm very eager to see, I think they're mostly done making the recommendations at this point. So I'm very eager to see those recommendations, because I think that'll be another opportunity for feedback. But unfortunately, we weren't consulted in that selection process.
In the future, I guess, if you do have an opportunity to speak with them again, would you bring like a Ms. High or Mr. Black with you to have that conversation so that they can get the on-the-ground perspective from folks from the community?
It's definitely something I consider. Like I said, my invite was for 5 minutes, and it was hard to fit a lot in there. So I did my best based on things that folks had told me and asked me to represent in general, without even knowing that I was going to be going to make that presentation. But I'm open to it. I'm not sure I'm going to get invited to do another one.
Speaking to another group that has gone to council recently, a lot of folks have raised concerns about the DC 2021 lobby group that's formed, that is made up of a lot of developers and corporations and folks that hold the reins to money within the city. And we know that council members and yourself had a meeting with them just before our last presentation when we had Chairman Mendelson. And it's really concerning, because it's, as a lot of folks on this call and people in the community have been putting out fires daily to make sure that they have their needs met. We have businesses who are doing the same thing, but in the vein of trying to capture funding and make sure that their funding is secure, versus making sure that that funding is distributed based on the needs of folks in the community. And so what is your take on the asks that they've proposed, and how do you think that they'll be received by the mayor and council, and what will you do to counteract that and make sure that all of these other groups, the public housing residents, the people experiencing homelessness, the folks who don't have access to safe housing and to other resources, can maintain and get that access in the midst of this lobby?
So I guess I didn't give that meeting as much weight as maybe some others did. And I say that because of that week I had that 30-minute meeting, I think a 2.5-hour meeting with medical professionals, doctors, clinics, and then another one with behavioral health professionals. I'm doing things like this, like hearing from these panels. So for me, it's, I didn't really take that any differently than really any other meeting that comes through my office. Like, I hear all the inputs, and then we look at everything that's before us and think through what are the problems we have to solve for in this year's budget. So, not having my notes from that call in front of me, I can't tell you exactly what their proposals were, but I can tell you that, they're only being given as much weight as really anything else that comes before us. And for those who've worked with me, that my priority has been human services and housing. And so that's going to continue to be my priority, the most vulnerable people that we serve. I mean, last year's budget amendment, I took away a business incentive to do more housing for homeless residents. So I think that's going to continue to be the path that I walk. And I will generally, when someone asks me to take a meeting, I say, yes, I have an open door policy. And so I'll continue that policy as well.
And in that vein, then, will you? I don't know if you have, but do you fully support the Ms. High's Park Morton equity plan that specifically gives a solution for how to house people that need housing right now in units that are already available, using a build first model, just kind of redirecting it?
So Ms. Hydeman and I have been working on this a long time together, and our hope has always been to keep the community together and to do the Build First at Bruce Monroe. But the option to take vouchers has also always been there. And so to the extent that residents do want to go to the REN, I'll certainly support them. And we've had these conversations ongoing since the proposal first came out.
So you're saying, yes, you will support Ms. Hyde's equity plan?
Ms. High and I have slightly differing opinions on how to get there. But as I've told her, I certainly support residents who want to go to the REN. And I also have secured funding for residents that want to purchase as part of the Park Morton development plan. But that funding doesn't extend to the REN because we don't have the ability to do that there.
So in this time, I guess, of COVID, where we are not in a normal situation at all, in what ways do you think we can redirect that funding to make sure a plan like Ms. Hyde's gets implemented in the way that the
I don't know the answer to that, honestly. It was really hard to secure the funding, and I'm proud that we did it, because I think Park Morton residents should have the ability to build equity. But my focus has always been on the primary project, and so I'm trying to work with Ms. High on her proposal as well, and do both at the same time. But that funding is locked in for the Park Morton site.
Okay, and just to circle back to, I know the initial comments, Ms. High and I had a conversation about this the other day, and I'm familiar with the Bruce Monroe Community Garden and some of the folks that are there, and we've had discussions about, what this means and what, just in general, what the context is. And for those of you who don't know, Bruce Monroe used to be an elementary school, and that was knocked down, and then the park was built. It was supposed to be temporary as people kind of discussed what was going to happen there. And then with the Build First discussions around Park Morton, that's when that site was chosen for that. It's right up the street. One of the things that we have been trying to kind of dispel the myths around how housing is being held up is that the lawsuit that you mentioned, there's been lawsuits across the city, and a lot of times those lawsuits are used to say lawsuits and a few residents in DC are able to hold up a ton of affordable housing. And quite frankly, that's just not true. Some of the housing is, there is housing that's being held up, but it's being held up for valid reasons a lot of the time. Of course, there's going to be some instances where there's folks who just don't want to have.
But that's not the case at Bruce Monroe.
Yeah, but for a lot of these instances, we are seeing luxury developments be built. So again, the mayor proposed a 36,000 housing unit plan when 24,000 of those units were going to be market rate. And that's not something that I think a lot of people think we should be putting our public dollars into, when the market would probably already do that anyway. And so I think we just have to see all of this in total, and we have to recognize kind of like what Ms. High is talking about, which is, if you have residents saying, we've been thinking about this is what we want, this is what we need to be funding those ideas and using those ideas and plans in order to make sure that people have what they need and have safe housing and are able to accumulate wealth. And to pivot over to Reggie's plan, the vacancy plan, which is quite similar. I'm not sure if you've heard of this before, if you've had an opportunity to kind of digest it while we've been already having this conversation, but is that something that you would be willing to support as well?
Well, what I was saying earlier was that it's not just about finding the vacant units, it also is about subsidizing the people who need the housing. And so I think they go hand in hand, right? I mean, the leaders at the Interagency Council on Homelessness, including Reggie, have worked with landlords across the city to get more access to housing units for people with vouchers. And that could be a local rent supplement voucher, a housing choice voucher, it could be a permanent supportive housing unit, a targeted affordable housing unit. And that's why I've been working to build out the subsidy. And we certainly need those partnerships. And so I really appreciated Reggie's call to everyone saying, if you have vacant units in your building, talk to your landlord, because we have people who need those units. So, I support any effort to get more units leased up to people that we're giving these subsidies to, because that's how we end homelessness. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Reggie, if you want to go ahead and respond to that.
Yeah, because, I know we've done a lot of work in that space, Councilmember Nadeau. And my concern is that a lot of the times, and I try to put this on there for Councilmember Barnes' committee, we have all of these units, like you said, we had over 1,000 units that we built within the last 3 to 4 years. But we're only getting, we're not even getting a full 1/3 of each of those buildings. I literally go and walk through those projects with Councilmember Bonds to show her that we should be counting each building as each one of our subsidies. So we already have a permanent supportive housing voucher in one of those units. Then minus that, we still have this gap of affordable units that could be going to people in rapid rehousing and TAH, but they're not getting those units. And, there are all kinds of questions about the reporting requirements of a lot of these buildings. There are many buildings in the city that I don't have that kind of data from DHCD on, and homeless people aren't getting those. And those are the landlords that we specifically want to target with vacant devourers, because they're getting the same level of tax returns every year as if they're renting those units. They're not giving them the homeless people, they're not giving them the low income people, and they're getting the same thing as if they were. Mm-hmm. And I think that we need to do more to get them into our space. And yes, we have done incredible work with trying to recruit new landlords, but we're not getting all of the landlords that we want. We end up in the same space, and case managers and them have shared this with me as well. We seem to be working with the same group of landlords. And when I was out going for a housing search, the way the landlords discouraged my case manager for even looking in their area, that was just ridiculous and trifling. I didn't like that. I'm regulated to a certain type of building of a certain type of age, right? And none of these new buildings are going to the people they're supposed to. For example, Maple Flats. You can walk in there and see that nobody from 801 got offered any apartments in Maple Flats at all. I'm trying to figure out how my case manager bypasses that coming to see me.
Okay. Well, so, I agree with you. I think it's a yes and, right? Like, we need to be building more housing that has affordable units built in, and we also need more subsidy, because the thing that's great about the subsidy is we can use it right away if we can find a match in the housing stock. And we have to, the building the housing affordably takes longer. So we need to be doing both. And we need to, just keep doing more of it, right? This is the conversation we were having when we were doing the comprehensive plan. And I haven't had a chance to talk about that much yet. And I do want to thank the Grassroots Coalition for their partnership on that, because we've got a lot of great work done in the framework. But the idea is to reduce barriers for building housing across the city and to build in places that we haven't been able to build before. And so that's been a huge focus of mine, because that's how we get there, right? Building more for the people who need it.
Yeah, and also making sure that the units that are being kept vacant are being filled by the people who need it too. I'm going to turn over to the questions that came into the chat, just in the interest of time, and then we can circle back around. Any panelists, feel free to ask more questions or send them to me too. But Renee, do you want to go ahead and read one of the questions from the chat, and go ahead and unmute yourself, please?
I will summarize about 3 questions in the Q&A. One questioner has asked about Greenleaf and Malcolm X, the conditions in each of those shelters, which hold 100 residents each, that they're no laundry facilities, people are eating and sleeping right next to one another, and what are you going to do about that? In addition, the family homeless shelter at Days Inn has the same problems, including a security officer who refuses to wear masks and gloves when conducting physical search of the residents. And these are crisis problems in the shelters. And what will the council member do to correct these emergency situations?
Great. Well, let me start by saying my first choice is never to put someone in shelter, it's to put them in housing. So let's start with that as our baseline. And that the temporary shelters for individuals, the thing I've been fighting for is to, right now during this health crisis in particular, move people into their own rooms, vulnerable people. Our chronically homeless population, it's hundreds of people who are over 60 and hundreds of people who have pre-existing conditions that make them more susceptible to the infection. And so we need to stop putting people in congregate sites that can't be managed properly, like the ones you're describing. And it's not any fault of the people trying to manage them. It's that they're not set up to keep people separated, right? And the Post just did a piece on this last night. So you'll, if you want to take a look at that, I talked about this a lot. And then the family sites, you know, we're moving those folks into housing. We're not going to be using the hotels anymore. And there's been a little bit of a lag since COVID-19 started, but now we're back on track moving people into housing. The family, short-term family housing that we've built in every ward has been beautiful and dignified, and people are feeling good about it. And that's the model that we should be using, not the hotels. And we've all been trying to address the various issues that come with housing people for long periods of time in spaces that aren't meant to be housing, like the hotels on New York Avenue. So I would say for the immediate, we're doing everything we can to move people into housing. I'm really pushing to get people out of congregate shelters and into their own rooms. And I certainly need help from advocates on that.
Here's a question, it's a little different, about inclusionary zoning units. The question is, what do citizens that are waiting for IZ, inclusionary zoning unit, to become available during this time, even if they've lost their jobs and source of income? What is being done to ensure that those who cannot afford market rate units don't become homeless because they're unable to pay the rent and cannot qualify for IZ units?
So I'm not exactly sure what the tie-in to inclusionary zoning here, but I'll say that, you know, obviously there's a lot of people struggling right now. Council's done a number of things to assist, and you know, that includes freezing rent increases. It includes requiring landlords to report to tenants if they've gotten if they've applied for mortgage forbearance, so that the tenants can then apply for the same relief, the same percentages of relief. We are putting more funds into rental assistance, but I think that's why I've been advocating for the rental assistance, because there's a lot of people in the same boat now. I mean, we've always had people struggling, as we've all mentioned throughout this conversation. There's always been people struggling with paying the rent in the city. We've had a rental housing crisis. We've had an affordable housing crisis in the city for much longer than we've had COVID-19. And that's why we have to do all the things we've been talking about. But in this crisis in particular, we need folks to talk with their landlords. I know some folks are organizing rent strikes, which is one way to go about it, to ask for that relief. And I think we're still continuing to figure out what's next after the measures that we've put into place. And that's why my focus is going to be on the rental assistance and getting everybody what they need to remain in their homes.
I think this questioner was worried. She's talking about people who've already received the IZ certification and now fallen on hard times. Will that be used against them? They're on the waiting list for the units.
Oh, I don't know the answer to that. I would say that, you know, anyone who's going through that, I'm always here if they want to contact me directly and we can work through it. And you know, there's a lot of different dynamics going on. I don't think anybody who's on the wait list right now is going to be penalized if they're going through a hard time. I understand that, like, if all of a sudden your number comes up and there's a unit and you can't afford it, that's going to be really, I mean, probably devastating, because you wait a long time to get off this list. So I just think, you know, we need to be working together, and that's what council members are here for, right? For assistance in that way. So if you know someone who's going through that right now, feel free to send them my way. I'm happy to work with them.
And Renee, I'm just going to ask a quick follow-up question on the rent control and the rent control issues. And this goes back to what Roger was saying too. I guess in kind of thinking through what rental assistance does, of course, it is a mechanism. It's kind of like ERAP, which is Emergency Rental Assistance Program, but expanded. So we're preventing people from not being able to pay for their rent, so that it prevents eviction and it prevents people from going into homelessness. One of the things that's been on my mind a lot is this so the federal government, like you mentioned, has also done bailouts, and it has provided assistance, and that assistance only goes so far. But some of those bailouts have gone to larger corporations and to banks, especially right at the beginning, in order to make sure that our economy continues to function. And that means, and I don't know this for sure, but in my mind, that means that some of those entities are likely in DC, and some of those entities are likely the recipients of rental payments. And so when we provide, and I'm not saying we don't provide rental assistance, so please don't have this come out like that, but I want to kind of look at this logically. When we provide rental assistance, or when I as a renter pay my rent to my landlord, that rent then goes to them, or it goes above them, because they need to pay for whatever loans they took out in order to have that property, or it might be ending up at the bank. And those are the same folks who are already receiving bailout money. They could be, so they may be kind of double dipping. And so I know one of the pushes that I have seen, I believe in DC and definitely in other places around the country, has been for a cancellation of rent versus a payment plan, or a way so that those entities continue to receive their rent. As we've talked about, housing is already exorbitantly expensive for folks, and so that is going to use up people's savings, especially if they're missing jobs. They may be getting some assistance, they may not be getting evicted, but it is going to potentially prevent them from getting back up on their feet, over the next year, 2 years. And so what are your thoughts on that concept, and as the cancellation of rent versus just allowing for folks to have a longer amount of time to give their money to entities that likely, at least the big buildings, are going to be just fine?
Yeah. I have a couple thoughts on it. One, and we were just having this conversation in the Office of the Tenant Advocate Forum a couple weeks ago. And I know some of my colleagues have looked into the legality of it and whether or not we are even legally permitted to do that. And there's a lot of ins and outs people are looking at that. One of the things that I've been thinking about as it relates to this is that, there are a lot of people in the district who've been able to continue to work and who are still getting paid. And in my mind, it's the obligation of those folks to continue paying rent and to continue paying for all the services that help keep the city, right? So it's to camping subsidize people who don't have the ability to pay right now. And that's why I wouldn't want an across the board rent cancellation, because I think we do need people who can pay to continue to do so, and then support the people who can't. And that's why I focused on the subsidy, because I think that's that if you do that, then you're getting the money to the people who need it. Just like you said, like, I am being paid as a council member. I don't need you to freeze my mortgage payment. I'm going to keep paying it. And that's going to help someone else who needs forbearance. And you think about what it takes to keep your buildings running. In an apartment building, we still need to pay the staff running the building. So we can't cancel all rent and still expect things to function the way that we need them to for the people who live there. So it's not as simple as just canceling rent for everybody. And so that's kind of the way that I've thought about it. And so my focus continues to be on how do we help the people who can't afford the rent? How do we make sure people are getting unemployment assistance, rental assistance, as chair of the Human Services Committee, making it easier for people to get cash benefits and SNAP benefits, because I think that's ultimately what's going to keep everyone afloat during this. I don't think we're done looking at this issue either, because we're not on the other side of this, and we're not really even close to reopening at this time. So I think we've got some time to sort it out, but there's a number of different ways to tackle it. So there isn't a straightforward answer yet on that.
Others have raised this, but I want to ask you to respond. Do you see a disconnect between efforts and organizations to provide temporary shelters versus efforts to set people up for home ownership or long-term housing? What are the ways in which aid initiatives to provide temporary housing to those experiencing homelessness could better work toward the goals of long-term housing and independence rather than just temporary shelter?
Again, this is a scenario where I think we need to be doing everything, right? When someone comes into shelter, that's an opportunity for us to better understand what that person's obstacles have been and what kind of housing they need. And so then we can assist them. And sometimes people are just hitting a bump in the road. They need a little bit of assistance. Sometimes we encounter folks who are going to need assistance for the rest of their lives, which is the permanent supportive housing model. So I think those two things are critical, ensuring that we have enough resources to do all that. When it comes to homeownership, each year that I've been here, the council has expanded the home purchase assistance program. That's down payment assistance to folks who would like to purchase a home. And that's been a huge opportunity for folks to build equity and housing stability. And it really does help all of our communities when folks have the opportunity for homeownership and to really be building that equity for themselves and their families that they can pass down. And that's an issue that's really, without these programs, our racial divide in the city is going to continue to persist. And so, I think we've got a lot of good programs. I think we need to keep building on them and supporting people both in housing stability through rental and through homeownership.
Here's an important question. The mayor's comp plan housing element is based on continued substantial population growth, but these projections are not substantiated by the CFO, and in fact suggest very small growth. The critical need is not for 24,000 units of market rate housing and only 12,000 for quote unquote affordable housing, but for 36,000 units of affordable housing, with much of that for those below 30% of median family income. What population projections do you believe and why? And let me add something to that question. The National Low Income Housing Coalition, their studies show the same thing, that families 30% and below the MFI are the ones that really need about 30,000 units alone. Can you respond to what population projections do you believe and why? And if you know even where the mayor's projections come from or based on?
So I don't know that we have to get into who's right and who's wrong, because I think the bottom line is that there's going to be population growth and we need to be prepared for it. And right now, we don't have enough housing for all the people who need it. And it's not just about who's coming, it's about who's already here, right? What are we doing to support DC residents? So my focus has been on the affordable housing, as I mentioned in my opening. I think one of the goals of the comprehensive plan is to make it easier for people to build all types of housing. So we do need housing at all income levels, because if we don't build the more expensive, and by we, I mean, builders, if the city doesn't have anyone building that housing, then people who can afford more are paying less than they should. And they're sort of sequestering that housing for people who need it. That's not where I've worked to invest local dollars, government dollars. But the comprehensive plan sort of makes it, the goal is to make it easier and more cost effective to build all types of housing. And so that we can focus our subsidies, in my mind, we can focus our subsidies on the people for housing that would otherwise not be built by the market.
Yeah, and I mean, we definitely all agree that the government should not be giving money to produce more luxury units, because that's a waste of our tax dollars for something that is already to be built. The issue, though, is that we haven't seen that shift because of the way that our housing system currently works. When we give more money, this is an inherent consequence of using a voucher-based system. People do need housing, so we provide vouchers, and that is dedicated. However, when we do that, we are continuing to say it's okay to have your rents be that high because the government will subsidize it and pay for it. So let's go back to the Hill East example for one moment. So for those of you who don't know, Hill East, Donatelli, like Reggie was mentioning, is a development company that is building 2 buildings down in the Hill East area, which is by Capitol Hill. And that is right by the old DC General Family Shelter, which used to house families. It was closed recently. It was a hospital turned shelter. And so that is now gone. But Donatelli, which is this development company, won a bid to get land, public land there, essentially for free, for I think something like $10. And in the initial plan, they had a specific amount of affordable housing that was going to be built in 2 buildings. But then over time, after the economy crashed back years ago, that kind of got reconfigured, and they were able to garner more financing, both from the city, from deeming it an opportunity zone, which provides additional financing supports. And then that whole affordability measure got completely redone. So they decided to instead build 1 building that was essentially just a regular large building with a ton of luxury units and an inclusionary zoning amount of affordable housing, which is just about, like Reggie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's either 8 to 10%. I can't remember exactly what that specific building has. But then they have another building that has not yet broken ground on that they said, okay, we're going to do 100 affordable units for people who need additional supports, like the council member was talking about, folks who are going to need, you know, case management services and things like that, who may not otherwise be able to access housing. So our 100 units will be just for them. The thing is, when we do that, that means that the government is going to pay for that full amount because those folks pay 30% of their income on that. So the developer for that project really made out because they got the free land, and then when they reconfigured their plan, they weren't required to give back any of the subsidies that we had already given to them. And so that has been one of the big issues, because we're still saying, you know, Donatelli, that's cool, like, thank you for providing this 100 units of housing, and we're going to now pay for it, even though we already gave you millions of dollars in free land and additional subsidies. And so it's okay to do development like that, and it's okay to build a bunch of luxury units like that, luxury units that are going to sit or, you know, house people who don't necessarily need those supports, or who have vouchers but who can't access them because the rents are slightly above the voucher amount, or because they don't have the proper credit, and that's a huge barrier for folks too. And so I guess we've just seen on this end, you know, that hasn't fully worked, and that's why plans that Ms. High is presenting, plans that Mr. Black is presenting, are so critical, because we do need to be thinking a little more creatively, especially now in this COVID time, to say, how do we reconfigure some of those ideas versus just kind of doing what has been done before.
Just to make sure people understand, with the inclusionary zoning, if you get a bonus density and or height, you are required to use only 10% of that entire footprint for affordable housing. And then they have the IZ Plus, which if you get an add-on to what you already got, now only 20% of that entire footprint is supposed to be a subsidized place. So a place, for example, you know, those 100 units, we would only get 10 of them through the IZ. And it's not coordinated where we would actually match those people to the unit. With IZ, it's a lottery. So you can pick random, you know, from hundreds of people versus 10 to 20 units per building. That's like 200 or 300 units.
So how do we, I guess this is a follow-up to that long comment that wasn't even a question for you, and I'm sorry for that, but how do we reconcile that? Because we know that development, like I said, development's already happening. There was just someone from Biz Now biked around the city. I don't know if you saw this, but there's an article where he lists out, I think it's something like 6,000 or 7,000 apartments and condos that are currently under construction right now in the district. And I guarantee that a majority of them are luxury units that will not be accessible to the, you know, 10 or 7,000 people experiencing homelessness right now, who, like you said, you're fighting to get decongregated, which is great. That is definitely a much needed first step. But how do we reconcile that, and how do we shift it so that now in this immediate need, we can make sure that we can accomplish the goal that you want to accomplish, which is to get them into that housing?
I mean, you started by talking about how expensive housing is in the market rate, right? And that it costs us more to use vouchers because of that. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, which is the comprehensive plan and how much more housing is needed in the city. Certainly the market is not going to do the things that we need for our lowest income folks. But if we do build a significant amount more of housing and allow the market to do that, prices will come down across the city. And we have not benefited from that in the District of Columbia because of all the restrictions we have across the city on building housing. The majority of the city right now, it's illegal to build more than one house on a lot. And that is, it's not acceptable because it makes everything so expensive. So this is it. And Office of Planning just released the report that I made them do on single family zoning. And, you know, I haven't even gotten all the way through it yet, but I think it basically makes the case that we do need more family size housing, but also that we need to be building more housing everywhere, and that we can't say certain neighborhoods are off limits for multifamily, because we're never going to get there. I mean, and the vouchers, even, you know, what we're paying, even though we only pay a portion and the federal government pays another portion and the feds decide what they pay and it's based on what rent is in the neighborhood. I mean, that underlying fact of how much it costs to live in the District of Columbia is not something we can change unless we change the way that we allow people to build in the city. And it costs us a lot of money when we're building the subsidized housing as well. So, I mean, I think that's sort of underlying the issue. I think the rest, I mean, it was a very long and very cogent comment, but it's going to take a while to unpack all of those aspects of it. And, you know, we're coming to a close. So I'm always happy to keep talking about these things. But the underlying issues are things that we do need to address in the comp plan.
And Roger, I'm gonna, and then I'll go back to Renee. I know you had a question that kind of relates to this idea that if we build way more housing, then that will automatically drop the price of that rental. But you had a question about what the secondary consequences of that might be on homeowners or on neighbors that are near that for when the land values go up. So do you want to ask that question yourself, or I'm happy to relay it? Go ahead.
I could ask the question, I suppose. What happens when this high density occurs, especially in neighborhoods where you have folks that are now on pension and the new high density buildings cause their property taxes to go up? Is there something that's in place to make sure that they don't get pushed out of property that they've already paid off the mortgage on, but no longer can afford the property tax?
So, as you know, we already do have a homestead deduction. We also have reduced taxes for seniors. And the other thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about inequity across the city, the majority of homeowners in the city are not people of color and not the communities that I think are most in need. And so that, I mean, I think that sort of weighs in on my answer here. But if our conversation today is about how do we help renters, how do we help build more affordable housing in the city, how do we prioritize government resources, then the answer is that we need to build more of it. In my ward, we're working on a equitable development plan for Lower Georgia Avenue. And it's modeled after the one that was done in Anacostia near the Bridge Park, where they ended up creating a land trust, which will keep those properties affordable. And I think we need to do more of that. In fact, the reason that I'm doing this in Ward 1 is that I'm hoping it'll be replicable across the city. We're looking at a corridor in the ward that is about to be developed. It's about to reach a tipping point where we have an opportunity now to say, how are we going to preserve the longtime residents, historically a community of color with homeownership? What are we going to do to help those folks? And there are people who have a lot more expertise in this than I do that we're bringing to the table to have these conversations, because I think we need to be having them citywide. But we're certainly going to be doing our part here in Ward 1 to ensure that people don't get displaced. There are folks in the city who've been waiting a very long time for progress to come to their neighborhoods, and they shouldn't be pushed out right when that progress is coming. We started off talking about Park Morton. Georgia Avenue is an incredible place to live right now. My hope is that we can keep as many of our Park Morton residents right here in this corridor, continuing to be my neighbors, because they have been the fabric of the community, whether it's the early childhood programming that came from some of the leaders there, or the clinics that have emerged. I mean, the leaders of Park Morton over the years have contributed so much to our community. It's just one example. So, I mean, I think you have to think about the big picture. And if our focus today is on how do we create more low-income rental, how do we build more equity for folks, and how do we ensure there's enough housing, then we have to be focused on building more.
Ms. High or Reggie, do you want to add anything before we maybe take one more audience question?
So I think that the thing I would say is, as far as, you know, any of the plans that the community comes up with, I think it's now sort of feasible to require anyone asking for any type of public subsidy from any council member or any body of council members, that they be required to take a look at that community plan. And if they are bent on having these public subsidies or public amenities or whatever coming from our tax dollars, they have to agree and implement the plans that the communities present. Because we have seen that happen all across the community where people have spent hours and days putting something together on their own. And then for whatever reason, there is no support for that particular initiative coming out of that community. So, that is something I want to see happen. We need to hold people in our city doing business accountable to the community they claim to serve. And if we find that they're not serving the community, then there has to be repercussions for that. And I think that requiring right now any of those emergency public funds from these entities, they should be required to actually implement these plans coming out of the community, especially folks like Ms. High and myself that have lived experience with the issue.
I just wanted to say that in the beginning of this redevelopment, the Landex and Morton group, the original development team, they included the residents in the development plan. We were the ones who designed our neighborhood. We decided what kind of buildings we want to see. We decided, how we wanted to be as a community. We did not get any say in this redevelopment, what we see. It was chosen for us. Everybody who did not live here got involved in the process. What they wanted to see, but do not live here. I just want to see that the residents are respected, that they are heard, that their children who are Washingtonians, born and bred, can remain here in their homes. I want to make sure that, following up off of what Reggie said, that anybody who does not adhere to the policies that they have implemented are held accountable, that anything that they do is adhered to. So we just want to make sure that we're partners at the table. When you're talking about our community, I've been here 19 years. May 8th, 2001 is the date I stepped foot at Park Morton. And I plan on remaining at Park Morton. I'm not going down without a fight. And anybody who wants to join that fight with me, I'm going to make sure that, their rights are adhered to, that, they know the law, that they know their rights, that they know that TOPA and DOPA rights are theirs to have, and they understand what it means. So with that being said, I just want to thank you all for having me today, and let's get this Park Morton equity plan rolling. Let's keep our community a community, because a community is only a community when you really know your neighbors. And I can walk out my front door and say, "Hey, Miss Hawthorne," who's sitting right here, "Hey, Miss So-so," and I can call plenty of my neighbors by name. But many of them now have been moved towards 7, 8, 5, 6, and 2. And I'm upset about that when we were told we could stay right here in Ward 1.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ms. I and Reggie, and thank you, Councilmember Nadeau, for being here again and taking these questions. I know there's a ton more questions, and we're just not going to be able to get to it because we do want to make sure we end by 3:30. So in that same vein that Ms. I just mentioned, I'm going to share my screen real quick just to show some of the next steps that people can do in terms of supporting. One of the questions that was in the chat was to, what can be done to support the equity plan from the Park Morton residents, the vacant to virus reduction plan, the rent control asks, decongregating the shelters, which is one of the things that our organization has been working on, increased testing and decongregating the shelters. So let's just take a look at this. And there's I'll let each of the panelists go ahead and discuss how, each of these things can be supported. So Roger, do you want to go ahead and talk about how folks can support the cancel rent actions?
You're muted.
And again, yeah, just make sure to unmute yourself.
Okay, I think I'm back on. For one thing, it's got to be communicated to the communities. People that are part of this can spread the word to people that they know. I would suggest that people that are not already a part of tenant associations form tenant associations, hold meetings and get involved and participate. And it requires that they do some work themselves, not just go to the meetings. That would be one answer. Also find out about, and I know I'm aware of not getting into partisan politics, but this is just a part of educating oneself. Find out who the candidates are that are running for elective office and decide after you found out what they are doing or propose to do, whom you should vote for. That'll go a long ways towards changing and addressing some of the problems.
Thank you, Roger. And then no one's on here to speak for Empower, so I'll just mention you can go to their website to check out how you can take action on the public housing asks, and it's $60 million for public housing is their ask. Reggie, go ahead. Do you want to say how people can support the vacant to virus reduction proposal?
Yes, people can start with contacting the following people, including your own landlord. There is Kenny McDuffie, who is actually Ward 5 council member and is co-chairing the Equity and Vulnerable Populations Group for the Reopen DC Advisory Group. There's Councilmember Bonds, who is chair of the Housing and Neighborhood Revitalization Committee. I want to thank Councilmember Nadeau, who's also chair of the Human Services Committee, and she is a person I think can carry this message. The chairman of the council, Phil Mendelson. There's also John Filchicchio and Saros, I cannot pronounce his name, but he is the real estate director of DMPID, and also your landlords. And make sure you tell them that they want the vacant to virus reduction plan implemented, not talked about, not discussed. We actually want this plan implemented. And if you want to contact me, you can email me at Reggie, REGGIE, Black, BLACKICH at gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. Ms. High, can you talk about how people can support the Park Morton Equity Plan?
Say again.
Can you go ahead and just let people know how they can support the Park Morton Equity Plan?
Yes, supporting the equity plan, you first can give me some signatures on change.org/Park Morton Equity. We need as many signatures as we can get to be able to prove that, people in the district support residents attaining home ownership, rising from the bottom level of poverty into somewhat a little bit of wealth. Also, asking the DC City Council to back us up. Kind of weighing in, leaning on DC Housing Authority to come on, lean on them a little bit, to back us up. Some people may get down to the rent and may like it. They may not want to come back to Park Morton. But a lot of the families right now are moving because Bruce Monroe just isn't coming up fast enough. And DC Housing Authority wants this property empty. So we need as much backing as possible to get our TOPA and DOPA rights by number one, attaining the signatures on the change.org petition, and to also get support, getting that petition in front of the DC City Council, and getting people to write letters, make phone calls to DC Housing Authority and DMPED and any of the higher ups, the developers, the DC Housing Finance Agency, all of the people who contribute to gentrifying our neighborhood. You know, we need everybody calling in to these folks and saying, this is a good plan. We need to implement this plan and more like this.
Do you have an email or telephone number you wanted to give out so if people wanted to contact you and your organization?
Yes, the council at Park Morton can be reached, myself. I'm the president of the council, and I can be reached at Park Morton Resident Council, and that's all one word, PARK MORTON RESIDENT COUNCIL at gmail.com. I'm not in the office as often. I'm usually in here on Saturdays now, distribute. If y'all look behind me, I have groceries. I got a delivery of food to give out to my residents. So I'm in here on Saturdays, distributing food to my residents. So if y'all want to reach me, I'm in here on Saturdays mostly, because during the week I'm at home with my oldest and my youngest. My youngest is 5, and I still have to teach her, you know, because school is still going on and she's still getting assignments, and I have to hold that schedule with her. And she's learning 2 languages, Mandarin, Chinese, and Spanish. Lord help me, Jesus, as I'm learning too. And so, you know, I have a lot on my plate. And so you can reach me on Saturdays here in the office at 202-733-1059. And my personal cell phone is 202-549-0439. If I don't answer, you will hear high alert emergency preparedness, because I am high alert emergency preparedness.
Great, thank you, Ms. High. And then just in the last couple of minutes, the last one that's on here is through the Washington Legal Clinic for the Homeless, which is where I work. And we have a letter and a petition that you can get on our website, which is legalclinic.org, that discusses the need to test and decongregate the shelters immediately. I know there were additional questions in the chat that came up about, you know, what's going on at the shelters, what's going on to make sure that people are protected and they are moved out and they are not further exposed to the virus, exposing each other and then inherently exposing other people as well. And so please go ahead and sign that. Reach out, like Ms. High said, reach out to folks. You know, Councilmember Nadeau is trying to push for this too, and we need to do this as quickly as possible. We can't stress that urgency enough, as you know, as everybody else is, I'm sure, feeling as well. In the last minute, I will just raise that we are coming upon budget season, as we know, and the budget hearing process is not going to be nearly the same as it has been, but each committee for the DC Council is doing their budget hearings a little differently. You can get dates for all of those on the DC Council website, and you can also get information about how you can testify at each of those in advance. So I recommend checking that out in advance so that you can figure out ways to get slotted in. Like I said, it's a completely different process. If you have questions about it, I'm sure you can reach out to Councilmember Nadeau. You can also reach out to any of us that are on this chat, or the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition. I'm going to put up the contact information, which hopefully you can see that, for the DC Grassroots Planning Coalition and Empower DC as well. So
do you want me to read it out for people that are on the phone?
Yes. Thank you for that reminder, Renee. So you can check us out on the Grassroots Planning Coalition on the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/DC Grassroots Plan. And the Empower DC on Twitter is @EmpowerDC, so EMPOWER. And then the Grassroots Planning Coalition website is dcgrassrootsplanning.org. So hopefully this information will be posted. Again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out. I want to give one last reminder about mutual aid as well. This was a big focus of our last event that we had through the Planning Coalition, and as Ms. High has been showing, it's continuing on today. So we can't forget that there are organizational cohorts throughout the city made up of community volunteers and organizers who have put together amazing ways to make sure that the community thrives and survives during this time. And the only way that they're going to be supported is through volunteers and donations. So please keep checking that out. Please make sure to keep supporting your neighbors. Think big. Like I read at the beginning from Naomi Klein, you know, in times of crisis, seemingly impossible ideas suddenly become possible. We just heard a bunch of ideas from a bunch of experts on this call, and I am very encouraged that we need to work together to be able to make those possible. So thanks so much for all of our panelists again. Thank you, Councilmember Nadeau, for joining us today, and hopefully we'll see everybody again soon.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. High.
Check out High Alert Emergency Preparedness on